Okay, so in theory we're live, I think. Hopefully it hasn't backdated too much. Hi, I know it's been a while since I've used the streaming channel. The news has been too depressing to do news roundups. I'm here talking with Jasper, who created... Is it Rolling for Seduction or Roll for Seduction? I keep getting it wrong.
It is Rolling for Seduction, yeah.
Rolling for Seduction, which is a sort of erotic, romantic supplement for 5th edition D&D. Now, this is a topic close to my heart. I've been interested in sort of sex and romance in RPGs and wondering why it hasn't been a more important and formative part of gaming than violence and everything else that we do, especially when you look at the other media that we consume that inspires and supports what we do in tabletop gaming. Obviously, I also run the Tabletopless D&D game with Porn Stars. So I just want to start off by asking you, I mean, what awareness do you have of other products and people in this area? Had you heard of the Book of Erotic Fantasy? Had you heard of Tabletopless? Had you heard of D&D with Porn Stars? Yeah, all of those things.
I'd say yes to the first half and no to the second. I actually became more aware of the surrounding communities as I began to research and put together the supplement, the book. And of course, I knew about the Book of Erotic Fantasy. I'd known that there were these supplements for previous versions that exist out there and have existed for some time, but to the best of my knowledge, there wasn't anything for 5e. At least not that I liked well enough. Only now do I have a fuller understanding of the communities that are already doing their own exciting things, like yours. And I haven't fully immersed myself in them yet because I didn't want to end up feeling like I was copying too much, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But you were aware of the Book of Erotic Fantasy. Have you read it? What was your take on that?
Yeah, I read it. I remember when I was quite young stumbling upon it at the local comic book store and thinking, oh, how interesting. I don't think I've ever been really satisfied, no pun there, by any of the supplements that I've read. Have you heard of Nymphology?
Yeah, I wrote it.
Oh, really?
I wrote.
Yeah, I feel like all these supplements have sort of a piece apart, and I wanted to see if I could do something that would combine the better parts of everything. And reading the Book of Erotic Fanfiction, what is it? Book of Erotic
Fantasy.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, no, it focuses on things that I don't think it needs to. And I wanted to see if I could do something. I think it's easy in these sort of pursuits for us to bring our own interests and our own fetishes into what we write. And I think the Book of Erotic Fantasy struggled a little bit with that.
Yeah, I can see how you get that impression from it. But I did get the feeling reading your book that maybe it's just the way D&D in particular supplements get written. It seemed to follow the same sort of pattern. You know, here's some character class options, here's some magical item options. I think that's just the nature of the beast when you're writing supplements for D&D. You can't help but fall into a certain pattern.
It's true, and I can't deny that I'm in many ways writing in a sort of a core book sense, like the same structure, the same patterns, and taking the same material step by step.
When I wrote the couple of supplements, I think you mentioned Nymphology and Quintessential Temptress, there was a lot of expectation and pressure to do it in the form of a comedy book. And the Book of Erotic Fantasy took a more serious tone. However, what I wrote has been taken seriously, and the Book of Erotic Fantasy has been derided. I've noticed yours seems to fall somewhere in between. It's like a conversational tone. You're clearly having fun with it, but you're not being comedic and you're not being too serious.
That's my hope. I've tried to find some sort of balance where I want people to take it seriously, but at the same time I try to tell in the book not to take it too seriously. Where you don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but I think the moment everyone takes sex as a subject extremely seriously, I think some of the fun, some of the joy just falls out of it.
Hmm.
And especially in role playing, as soon as you're playing a D&D game and you demand that everything's serious. Uh, though that works for some people, I don't think it works so well for me.
Yeah, I mean, while you're playing, you can take things out of character less seriously and in character more seriously. There's a kind of dichotomy there. You can have a really fun time while your characters are having a really horrible time. So
Yeah.
that that helps a bit. I mean, sorry to keep referencing back to it, but yeah,
No, go for it.
this has been my experience in the past. There's always been this massive amount of pushback whenever anyone has tried to tackle these subjects, whichever way they've tackled it. Have you had any pushback or derision, nastiness?
I've been lucky enough to evade most of that, but I assume it will be coming my way, before too long. I think always, like you say, these sorts of things, they invite a certain amount of pushback because, it's the same old song and dance. Like the people who want to get offended, of course, will. And I've really done my best to write the book as inoffensively as possible. But of course, you know, there's only so much one can do.
Yeah, what's bizarre to me, what's disjointing to me as someone who's been gaming since the 80s, is how it's shifted from the sort of evangelical right-wing Christian types and the sort of more sort of prudish criticism to now it's coming from the opposite side of the political spectrum a lot more. We'll come back to that.
Pendulum movement, isn't it?
Pardon?
Oh, it's interesting, that pendulum movement, isn't it?
Yeah, same shit, different different group of people.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's some contradictions in how you've tackled some of these more sensitive subjects in the book. Like, consent obviously is important, but then there's quite a lot of implied sexual coercion or sexual violence in some of the examples that you give. But
Yes. So,
you're very careful about the language that you use through most of it, but that contradiction is still there. Could you just talk me through how you made your decisions about that?
absolutely. So I think this is undeniably one of the hot button topics of, like, one of the things that people, often for good reason, get kind of offended about. Because, we've all heard these stories of people sitting down at tables and the game masters or the players themselves have ideas about, oh no, you've fallen asleep, what will happen next?
Mm.
Or, and uh, this book I intended to be as accessible as possible. I figure I can go different places with different supplements that people have better information about whether they want to pick up and add to their games. But I say several times in the book pretty seriously that everyone, not only the players at the table, but also the characters involved, all of them should be giving consent that whatever situations they find themselves in. And I don't think there should be any, especially for people just trying this out for the first time, I don't think there should be any flexibility on that. I think that everyone at all times should be comfortable with what's happening. And I have, the first couple chapters are devoted to, are you sure you want to do this? Are you comfortable doing this? Are you really sure? and how to make sure that your players are on board with you. But you're right. There are those contradictions where sometimes the situations mentioned or the spells, right? You
Hmm.
take any given spell and let's say like a love potion. You give someone a love potion, and in truth, you are altering someone's perception to uh, perhaps to coerce them. And I don't think there's any way to write a love potion without that possibility, without saying, by the way, the person who drinks this love potion, if they're not okay with whatever happens, it ends instantly.
Yeah,
And
which kind of defeats the point of a love potion.
yeah, and instead, I think I'm kind of forced to presume upon the game master, especially, and also the players, to recognize uh, everything should be in the spirit of fun and shouldn't be aiming to coerce anybody or hurt anybody. I think there could be tables where everybody everybody has their own senses and their own sensibilities, but this book is really intended to be pretty vanilla and safe.
I mean, there's no reason you can't play at different levels. I mean, something bad can happen to your character, but you fade to black, so you don't have to play through it or whatever.
Exactly.
There are different levels to it all.
Or the difference between consent that the player gives and consent that the character gives.
Yeah.
And you of course your GM can come to you and say, "Look, are you okay with this kind of sketchy situation?" And the
Yeah.
player can say yes, or the player can say no. But
I mean,
that's higher level.
I think you've been so careful and accommodating with your language that I wouldn't think there would be any problem with you selling your product on a larger site like Drive-Thru RPG. Was there any reason why you didn't? I mean, it is the single largest sales point for this sort of thing.
Yeah, I wasn't. I wanted to start out slow because, as you say, this sort of thing can have a pretty significant blowback, and if I if I so right now I sell on Gumroad and I sell on Patreon, and if I'd received like a certain amount of ire from that decision, then I could make an informed decision about whether to sell on Drive-Thru. But I think now that no one's left up with pitchforks, that now would be a good time to try that as well.
I'd be happy to help you out if you wanted any help getting set up on there
I
or
appreciate
anything. Yeah, I've been on there
I think-
for ages. So.
I think you have a really valuable amount of information and knowledge on this topic. So I'd be happy.
Well, I hope so. So, I think the culture of gaming has changed in a lot of ways. The younger cohort of gamers who didn't live through the Satanic Panic, for example, and maybe aren't quite so sensitive to the threat from there. I see this. I mean, we touched on it. We see this moral puritanism and this pushback, like you've described. We see a lot of that, but coming from different people. Yet at the same time, there is this massive drive to push and to include things that would have set the evangelicals of the 80s, frothing at the mouth. There's a lot of streamers, a lot of online gamers, and so on, who very much like to include LGBTQ plus. If I'm missing anything out, sorry. There seems to be a sort of contradiction and tension between those two things. That queer sexuality is to be celebrated and elevated, while expressions of heterosexuality in gaming are to be decried and pushed down, and there just seems to be a contradiction there. What was your sort of personal sort of guide and litmus test for how you tackled these? Because I think in some parts of your book you've gone one way, and in some parts of the book you've gone the other.
One way and then the other. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, there's kind of some questions I've got later about that, but you go out of your way to be inclusive, perhaps, as we'll get to a bit later, perhaps over-inclusive of alternative sexualities. I'm saying this as someone into kink, which is an alternative sexuality. And then at the other time, you also stress the default is male female. That the default is quite a vanilla sort of setting. Nothing too kinky, nothing too strange.
Right.
Topics to avoid, that sort of thing. So you kind of snake between the two.
Yeah,
So,
and undeniably, like a lot of the. Well, I guess I should say first that I expect the majority of the players to be, generally heterosexual, generally, probably mostly male readers. Although I don't by any means mean to exclude women or think that women can't have fun with this sort of game. Obviously, they do in yours.
yeah.
And undeniably, a lot of the art that I'm using is male, female, or so on. But let's see. I think it's important to be inclusive and available to people. I don't mean to. I don't mean to preference one way over another. I think that there's a certain amount of like market drive that just makes sense. So like if you're selling to men, you want some pretty woman on the cover. If you're selling to women, you want some pretty man on the cover. And those are different in presentation. But generally speaking, I want to make it so that anyone who's interested in this aspect can come and enjoy it. And I had a sort of one of the most heavily edited parts of the book ended up being the character creation, character generation, and parts bit, because I went back and forth about, do I say explicitly, here are the things you can do? Do I contemplate, what if people want to switch this way or that way? And in the end, as much as I could, although I'm sure it deserves some more attention, I tried as much as possible to leave it to the player and to the game master. I think I have some sections where I say to the game master over the course of the book that really the important thing here is to let people play what they want. A game master I admire, Matthew Colville, says people can do X, people can jump on a dragon, people can turn themselves into Bahamut, and they can not do that in any other game. They can only do that in your game. And I think that's a good saying to live by.
I think
let people play what they want.
Yeah, I think by and large you've negotiated the space with skill. It's a tightrope.
It is, undeniably, and there's no arguing that there are people who are looking for a slip off the tightrope.
Yeah,
and would be happy to point at it.
Yeah, you definitely need a thick skin in this business these days. Far in excess of the rewards. So your art choice, you chose to go with very classical and public domain artworks. So I think there's some from the pulps. There's a lot of classical styled paintings of nymphs and Greek athletes, that sort of thing. There's a lot of stock art available that edges on the sexy, and there are even free resources, erotic art offered to people who include LGBT content. Was there a reason you chose, other than just it being free, you chose to go for the classical and public domain art? I mean, Is it trying to bring a bit of class in to deflect some criticism? Like, you shoot it in black and white, it's erotica. If you shoot it in color, it's
Right.
porn. Yeah, is it, what's why
Yeah,
did you
no,
make that choice?
there's definitely a bit of that. Is I want to avoid people pooking, people picking up the book and thinking to themselves, ah, there's all sorts of sexy pictures I can find in here. Which there are naked, there are nude portraits, nude paintings, some masters, uh, and I think they're to be appreciated, but I personally don't find them particularly arousing.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think that distinction is worth making. But like you said, not all the free art, the available art would be necessarily erotic, but could be verging on the sexy. The truth is just it ended up being the easiest and and simplest way to bring some life to the pages. Uh, in my ideal world, I'd probably have um, I'd probably have commissioned a great deal of art to go inside the book, and I have plans to commission something for the front of the book. I think that would be the best place to start, the cover.
Yeah, yeah,
Because right
definitely.
now it's, yeah, of course, a painting.
Hmm.
Um, but but it offered the greatest breadth uh, and depth of art that I was able to find,
Hmm.
as well as some pretty silly illustrations that I also came across when I was searching for those sorts of expired art domains.
Yeah. You spend quite a while going into problems that are kind of, but not entirely unique to erotic roleplay. I think you say, these things happen in ordinary games as well, but they tend to be heightened in erotic
Hmm.
roleplay, like people getting unhealthy attachments to other players or other characters, or crossing the line into being creepy, relationships forming and breaking up, and the fallout from that. I mean, I used to run big vampire LARPs, which were basically um, pickup joints for a lot of people. So I'm familiar with that. But so I take it some of this comes from bitter experience. You've had these problems in your own games.
Yeah, most of or I should say, uh, the greatest breadth of experience I have is in role play uh, in general. So I've done a lot of writing role play, and some of that's been erotically minded, and some of it hasn't. And you see these sorts of problems everywhere, I think, and it becomes worse when you add that element of sex or sexuality in. And so I've had, like you say, those some of those bitter experiences. I've heard of other people's experiences with them as well. Luckily, I've never yet run into any of the really bad ones, but I think that may be in part to how over careful I am about it,
Hmm.
and that's why I recommend so much caution to GMs, especially the ones starting out,
Yeah.
trying this sort of thing for the first time, because it can creep up on you without you realizing it.
As you mentioned, I think most of the erotic play that goes on tends to be online. I think there's
Hmm.
a measure of remove and anonymity and
Absolutely.
safety that people get from interacting anonymously online, whether it be IRC channels like The Lonely Inn, or whether it be Second Life. There's a lot. I wrote Tales of Gore. There's a lot of Gorean sims on Second Life, which I talked to the communities of as I was writing the game. Blue Magic, I found an online game that was using that as the basis for rules around sort of horny adventures around a magical university, things like that. But do you think it can really successfully cross from that safer online world into tabletop or streaming?
Well, obviously you've had a measure of success. And I don't think there's anything that necessarily says no, it can't. But I think you increase the difficulty as soon as you bring the more real you make it. I think a lot of the like even outside of the erotic element, as soon as you're doing role play, there's a certain amount of suspension of embarrassment
Hmm.
that you have to undertake. So if I'm talking as Bob the giant dwarf, then as soon as I make a silly voice for Bob, I can't be thinking to myself, "Oh no, they're really gonna hate this one." And, and so that sort of that's a skill that you practice, especially GMing, but certainly being a player in D&D or any other role-playing game. And I think that it really tests that to the limit uh, when you're in person, because you have all these social cues of looking at the other people and thinking to yourself, "Oh no, my impression, it isn't going over so well." And I think one of the easiest ways to stifle uh, any like sexual exploration role play. Say you've got a normal tavern, you've got a normal game, and you're just beginning to think to yourself, "Well, I want to seduce the barmaid." That's the classic one. Uh, and the second you begin second guessing yourself and wondering about, are other people gonna freak out about this? Are the other players okay? Are they judging me behind my back? That I think is the worst inhibitor to people being open and explorative about sexual roleplay. And so I think the being out of person removes some of that tension, some of that worry, especially if you know each other already or have met each other through already uh, erotic or open-minded means. And
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
so in book, yeah, go on.
I was going to say with tabletopless. I mean, obviously, everyone involved is explicitly there for explicit content, which took a lot of any of the hedging and embarrassment out of it.
Hmm. And I think that's worth.
Yeah, but even we don't do that much sexual RP. It's that tends to be in the sort of background materials, the support materials on the website, and what the girls do on the stream, rather than necessarily the characters. Though we're trying to amp that up a bit as we all get more comfortable with it. So even for people who work in porn, it can be difficult and inhibiting to
Yeah.
get past that. Yeah.
And I think the number one thing that a GM who wants to run something like this can do is to take out as much of that embarrassment as possible. In the book, I've written a couple sections with the express intent that they're kind of silly. So like the idea of being in a statistical or ability check, fight for your life in quotations, against an NPC, like, can you successfully satisfy the terrible wizard of Skull?
Yeah.
Uh, roll athletics, roll sexuality, roll what have you. I think if that's made intentionally silly in some ways,
Mm.
it's a lot easier for people to be comfortable with the material.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, that was certainly the case.
some of that embarrassment.
Writing Blue Magic, certainly that was the case. So a lot of streamed games, I find, have a lot of romance plots in them, a lot of inter-party romances on a lot of the more popular streamed games, but there's never any real payoff to it. So
Mhm.
yeah, it always pulls up short of anything sexual. And when some of these reasonably popular stream games have included sexual content, there has been a lot of pushback, even if it's just implied, or if certain people perceive it in a certain way. Were you aware of what happened with Adam Coble?
I wasn't.
So he had a game stream that was quite successful, and then in one of the scenes, one of the characters is like an android,
Mhm.
and her character, which is male, goes into this robot fix-up shop to get some damage repaired. The guy who runs the shop is a bit of a bot fetishist. And so Adam goes through this whole scene very, very slowly, very, very carefully, but it culminates in getting a sort of black market plug-in that gives you the robot equivalent of an orgasm. And that led to, not in that moment, but afterwards, with a lot of feedback on social media, that led to the whole game collapsing, people quitting, him saying, "Oh, I've got to learn to do better," and so on. And yet, watching it, while I could feel the cringe, nobody actually brought up that there was a problem, and he was using an X card in the background as well, and nobody used it. So, I mean, it's so fraught, it's so difficult, especially if you're doing players of performance. Do you still think it's worth it to include these themes?
I think it depends. I think there's some groups it's just never going to work for, and I don't think that's a problem. I know personally, when I was young and I was reading these books that verged into young adult or just past it, I really felt like there was something missing when they did and then they went and they kissed and we're done. And I'd always felt there was a missing link somewhere between out and out pornography and what's available to read. And in the more mature books that I've read as I've aged, I've found now and then, very rarely, good examples of some marriage of the two. I think anyone that feels similarly to that is probably going to be at least open to the idea of this kind of game, or it might at least work well for them.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but can you think of any examples of where you think it's been done really well?
Oh God. I read some of my initial answer would have been 5 years ago, Piers Anthony. But I've in the time since then, I've read some of the less popular and more controversial works he's done, and now I'm a little hesitant. I guess all I could say is I don't think there are very many good examples. I think that's a really lacking field.
I think Richard Morgan, Altered Carbon, and his fantasy books as well, I think he does it quite well, because it gives you an insight into the characters, and it doesn't shy away from anything, but it fits into the storylines, and the worlds that he's created. It helps define the worlds. I think Peter F. Hamilton, to an extent as well, sex becomes part of the way many of his characters are written. They're both science fiction examples, but I read more science fiction than fantasy, so I suppose that's more of my gauge. But I think those do it quite well.
I'll have to give them a try.
So, to come back around to the X card and the consent forms. Now, I understand why people like them. Personally, I don't really see the need. Because most of the time you're either playing with your established group who you know pretty well, and you know each other's boundaries, and you're not afraid to speak up to each other, or you're playing in like a convention or a game store setting. You've said what kind of content will be in your game on the sign-up sheet, and at any time people are free to leave. Whereas I find things like the X card to be unacceptably disruptive at the table. Like, everyone else is in full flow and enjoying what's going on, and when one person taps the X card and it spoils everybody else's fun, or you have to completely change your game around at the last minute. Consent forms are a bit similar. If you're running a game that has less prep time, like Fate or something, it's not such a big deal to change the game on the fly. But something like D&D, which is heavy on prep and so on, if someone turns up with a consent form that explicitly rules out something that you've put. I'm not just talking about sex here, but it's massively disruptive and disrespectful to the GM. And shouldn't you just not play or step aside for that scene or something?
Right.
So I'm interested in your take on that, because obviously we've come down on different sides despite having similar attitudes to sex in particular in play.
Yeah, well, so the consent forms that you mentioned, what I've tried to do in my book is to establish during a session 0 what everybody's comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I expect that to be a mostly firm idea. And that, I think, is the best time to get out of the way if someone doesn't like this and that's just a deal breaker.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, not even bringing sex into it. But if I said, wow, I really come to D&D in order to role play the tragic demise of a hero. I really love Greek tragedy. And if the player to my side says, I really only want happy endings here, then immediately that's a roadblock.
Yeah.
And the same thing definitely is true for sexual things that people are focused on, and sexual themes that people are uncomfortable with. If so, I see what you mean about the X card, and I've been conflicted about it personally, because I agree undeniably it breaks the flow. If 5 people are having fun and one person says, well, this just really isn't my cup of tea, you're right. The less disruptive thing is to leave. But especially in online communication, I think it's important to lean towards the over confrontational. Maybe it's the way that people are nowadays, or maybe it's because of how the internet is in general. But I think when people get together to write or to play or to role play, it's very tempting to not identify the problems and die a slow death. I've had D&D games myself where I've lost players because there was something that they didn't like. And it wasn't anything shocking or really integral. It wasn't like, well, we're playing this Age of Worms campaign, and I can't stand worms. Did I never mention that? It wasn't anything silly like that or large, but it was something that became a bigger and bigger issue because no one talked about it. Yeah. And the GM, there's only so much you can do to say, well, did you have any major issues this session? Could you please bring them to me? And so in one long-running campaign that I've had, maybe 2 or 3 years, not so long-running in the sense of things, but I've lost 4 or 5 players that each, I think, went through that same process of, I have an issue, but I'm not really comfortable talking about it. Maybe I don't think it'll be a big deal and it'll go away, or maybe I don't know how to express myself about it. I think the better thing to do is to have that option to just arrest things. It doesn't necessarily mean that people will use it, and probably, like you say, it's better if they don't. And certainly it's better if they don't, and that means that they aren't troubled by anything. But to have that sense of security, I think, is important for some people.
Yeah, I find it more of a problem with horror games, really, because the point of a horror game is to transgress, to scare, to unsettle, and if someone's X-carding constantly, you don't really have a game anymore. But I think it does turn up in these other areas. What we did with Tabletop Plus was more to have the players assert what they did want to be included. And I have less of a problem with this around sexuality because it's so deeply personal, what turns you on, what turns you off. But conflict is where story is. So, you pushing at those limits isn't necessarily creepy, it's more affecting. It creates better, more engaging stories, I think. So that's where I am on it. I just don't see the need for X cards with players with whom you're familiar, and in those other circumstances. If you don't like spiders, why did you sign up to the Spider Temple of the Spider God game at this convention?
Right.
What are
are
you
you
even
doing down in
doing?
the Underdark?
Yeah, and I'm the bad guy for saying this game's probably not for you. It's just
Right.
yeah.
Well, so to ask you, do you find I have no disagreement with the conflict making for a good story. I think absolutely that's where a good story comes from. Do you find that you have positive and compelling results from pushing conflict around sexual topics?
I mean, I'm engaged and interested in that as a topic, but it's hard to find players who are into it. It was a big component of the vampire LARPs that we did, and there was a
Hmm.
lot of tension around uses of disciplines like dominate and presence and how that related to sexuality and so on. But even without any prompting from me as a storyteller, just due to the nature of vampire, I think as a game and as a genre and as a form of fiction pre-Twilight, there's always that erotic subtext from Dracula right on through.
Yes.
In other games, the way sexuality has tended to manifest in my games is that it's there in the background for you to engage with if you want to, and NPCs might be sexually attracted to you, and that's how it might play off. So, while I would like to engage in more erotic RP that is more challenging, like I do in Tabletopless, where I'm having a lot of fun, it's a dream project in a lot of ways. Up until then, I haven't had too much practical experience outside of Vampire, Tabletop, and LARP, where everyone expects to be manipulated and controlled by each other.
Right.
So it's a very forgiving sort of setting for that sort of thing.
There's also a lot of uh, vampire and I would say vampire themes are not so different from BDSM themes. And I
Yes.
think uh, there's a lot of healthy understanding about give and take
Mm.
in BDSM communities. Of course, there are certainly people and places that think, we tie each other up and that's the game.
Yeah.
And of course,
I cer-
what
I cer-
Twilight did to vampires, 50 Shades did to BDSM.
I certainly find the kind of consent that goes on in the BDSM community. If you go too far, that's when the safe word is said, and that's the point at which you back off. But people are willing to be forgiving and understanding. In the heat of the moment, or whatever, you might push a button you didn't mean to, or whatever. That seems to me to be a much healthier approach than affirmative consent at all times, which
Yes.
seems to be the sort of current zeitgeist. Rather consent is something you can withdraw at whatever point you want. But yeah, I think the biggest crossover between erotic RP is with the BDSM community. I think people who are into kink or work in porn or adult industries anyway are much more open to this sort of thing and much more relaxed around it. It's not such a complex for them. So yeah,
Yes.
it's interesting. So probably worth a paper if anyone out there's doing a
Yeah,
psychological
certainly.
study.
I'd be interested to read. My background is in psychology,
Mm,
and I find all sorts of delves into that very fascinating.
yeah.
But what I think I'd say about I think I'd reiterate that I think the give and take and uh, the comfort with knowing that someone will, respect your safe word. I think that these are skills we acquire
Mm,
and comfort we develop. And I think that expecting everyone who comes into a D&D game looking for some sort of sexy time to have that kind of maturity and that kind of uh, awareness of themselves and comfort is uh, is a mistake.
mm,
I think that more, in many ways, I'm trying to write this book for the perspective of a GM who's just trying this out for the first, second, third time. I think that someone like you, or whoever would have more experience in this sort of field, would find it lacking in a number of ways, because it's not written for someone who already is comfortable with the material.
Mm.
And so in that interest, I think being over careful is the best way to make sure people stay safe and have fun.
You've just
But
made
if
me
I
think.
was to,
You've just
yeah.
made me think of a really good analogy for the X card. Right.
Oh, go for it.
So say there's 6 people at an orgy, all at it, hammer and tongs, and someone decides, oh, this isn't for me anymore. They get up and leave. It doesn't stop anyone else having fun. Whereas the X card is like turning a fire hose on the orgy. Stops everybody.
Yeah. Pulling the fire alarm.
Yes, something like that.
Sprinklers start going. And that's no good. You don't want to have it like that, certainly.
Yeah. So while we're kind of touching on taboos and transgression, you do touch on this a bit, but I saw some potential problems with the things that you were saying. There were the contradictions about sexual violence, because some of the time you say this shouldn't ever be part of it, but then you say as long as everyone's okay with it, which is the right point of view, but there seems to be a slight contradiction there. Abuse, you say you should probably steer clear of. That might turn up in horror scenarios or character backgrounds. Torture and death. Again, sometimes it's hard to. The quintessential example would be the vampire who seduces someone and then kills them, for example. Filth, age of consent. You say about your local territory, but if you're playing internationally with people, that can be a huge sticking point, because I find the age of consent here is 16. I find most Americans react to that with open-mouthed horror. And it's even lower in some places in Europe. So that seems like a mess and something that could potentially go horribly wrong. But at the same time,
very good advice.
Yeah, but at the same time, you're not your character. So and speaking from personal experience, as a teenager, teenagers do get up to things, So if you're playing a teenager, what do you do there?
Yeah.
So,
and these are undeniably sticky areas.
Yeah.
Do you err on the side of I guess you can involve this so long as you're not hurting anyone? And I think the answer is, in almost all circumstances, except the really scary ones, I think if everyone present is fine with it, even enjoys it, there's no problem bringing it into your game. And I have plans for further expansions to this that are free to explore some of the less mainstream interests, or more curious kinks.
Yeah.
But I think I err in this central core book towards just stay away from these issues, because they're probably going to give you more trouble than they will provide you fun.
I mean, it's just one of those few areas where I felt you were lacking, even as an introductory book. I felt like each of those deserved a paragraph or something at least to talk about them.
Okay.
It did coming up for this interview. It did make me think of something I've run into with the Tabletopless game. So it's overtly and predominantly a sexual game. So what I'm finding is that I'm getting a little bit antsy about things that wouldn't normally mean anything in any other game that I would just do without even thinking about it. So like a classic adventure trope is to delve into the sewers to kill off giant rats or whatever.
Right.
And we did have a part of the game in which they were down in the sewers, and I found myself thinking, oh my god, am I setting off someone's scat fetish? Ugh. It makes you hyper aware of things that you wouldn't necessarily give a damn about in a normal game setting. So that's something to watch out for, I think. So I lost my place. We've done things a bit out of order than what I intended.
Sorry about that.
Oh yeah, one piece of advice I thought was really good was just the inclusion of sexually open or solicitous NPCs as a way to establish the game as being an erotic game. Do you play computer games much?
Oh yes,
So
tons.
we've had the trend with the BioWare games of them
Hmm.
always including romance and subplots and a little highly censored sexual cutscene. I
Hmm.
haven't found though past the first couple of times. I haven't found those particularly engaging because it always felt like you were kind of doing a pickup artist checklist. Do the quest for this person, give
Following,
them this particular
right,
item,
following the
then
guide on the
yeah,
Wikipedia.
and then you get
I
to sleep
always,
with them. You know?
yeah, I always remember I played Dragon Age. I don't remember whichever one had Morgan in it,
Yeah,
and I was thinking, here I am at this good place in this quest. Maybe I'll see if I can progress down her romance line. And I read on the Wikipedia article or wherever it was that you have to give her these gifts, and I had five or so gifts on my person. And so I discovered that in the process of five gifts in one night, we went from, like seldom buddies to suddenly the most romantic couple.
yeah,
I think games suffer a lot from that, from the either pickup artist nature of like, well, I've checked all these boxes, now you have to sleep with me,
yeah.
or from the uh, sort of arbitrary checkpoints that can lead to just a totally mangled effect.
Yeah, and people talk up the Bioware games like Dragon Age for including this stuff, but it always struck me as slightly creepy. But I would contrast that with The Witcher, at least The Witcher 3, I haven't played the other
Mm.
ones, where the NPCs were attracted to you, they wanted to jump your bones, they actively engaged in pursuing you as much as you would, if you wanted to, engage in pursuing them.
That's a good point.
I found that much more engaging, and that seemed to me to be what you were advising in your book. I think that is absolutely a much better way to go.
Yeah, I think that no player wants to feel like they're badgering the poor man behind the bar or whatever.
Yeah,
But much more exciting if he slides you a drink and says no charge, gives you a wink, and so on.
yeah, yeah. And even if he's a creepy old sot, you've still got a free
Right.
drink out of it, and you don't have to give him anything.
Exactly.
So it's all good. But that was some really good advice, I think, just
I'm glad.
as a way to reframe the game, is to think of the NPCs as also being sexual beings. I thought that was probably the keynote piece of advice in the whole thing. I think for making a
I'll
more
bold and underline it.
yeah. One thing you suggested that I hadn't really thought of, I don't think I'd be comfortable using particularly, was the use of audiovisual stimuli. So I'm guessing that would be sending people links to GIFs or short videos or sound and so on. I will admit to having used the temple orgy music from Conan as background to play once, but that's about the extent of it. Can you sort of clarify what you were suggesting there and how you would see
Yeah.
it being
So
used?
I think just visual and then audio visual. I think that as GMs, and maybe you have a different experience, but I often have an image in my head of what I'm describing. And so if I have a temple, for example, in mind, I'll know, well, there's this altar here, there's that altar there. And when we're online, we make do with tabletop top-down maps usually. And often there can be really fantastic art available that can bring players into the experience. So an imposing temple facade or a really scary picture of a dragon that makes you really get that this is, yeah, a big boss, very scary. And the same thing for audio to help players get in sort of get in the groove. Um, and of course, I don't see any reason why that shouldn't extend to the erotic or the pornographic. You take a picture of some to use the quintessential barmaid, the pretty barmaid with her with their cleavage exposed, serving drinks. You say, well, this is something like what I'm thinking about, and that sort of visual stimuli gets the players thinking. Uh, but I, I don't know, audio visual together, I think is going to be very limited in scope. For one thing, it's harder to find something that matches what you're looking for. I can think of very few. Uh, Usually, it's in the field of animation, and sparsely even there,
Hmm.
when role playing or Dungeons and Dragons or fantasy in general meets erotica. And certainly, there's some good stuff in there, but there's not much. But I
Hmm.
think maybe if you manage to find something that really, really evoked the type of scene you were going for, even if it was only mildly erotic, then you could present it to the players and say, well, look at this. This is what I'm thinking along the lines of.
Hmm. One thing um, that kind of made me cringe reading the book was the rolling for sexual characteristics. Now, I cringed because I don't know if you're aware of the existence of fatal.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it
Oh,
gave
no,
me.
I made a reference to it in the book and then I stripped it out. Uh, a litigation purge.
Yeah, because I was starting to have PTSD flashbacks to
Mhm.
anal circumference and
Oh my God.
things like that. Looking at that, why did you
3 foot nipples? How
why
did that
did
happen?
why
Yeah.
did you decide to include that?
Yeah, so mostly that ended up being uh, I intend it as a guide to the DM for quick NPC creation, but I don't think I made it as clear as I could have.
Hmm.
In the beginning, I was thinking, well, yeah, you give your players this list and you have them roll on it, and oh no, they've got huge what's its.
Yeah.
But I think I include a small box on the side or a side note that says, honestly, really what you should be doing is you should just let your players pick what they prefer and go from there.
Hmm.
By the same token of, uh, they can not be dragging along some giant member in any other game,
Hmm.
uh, as much as it would strain credulity. But yeah, so I should go over that part again and make certain that uh, it's obvious that it's a for DM or players who really want to just roll the bones
Hmm.
section.
There's a character in a Ben Elton comedy book who's a Vietnam veteran who got his balls shot off in Vietnam, and he plays D&D, and his wizard character is almost exactly like him in every regard except for two gigantic testicles that he has to carry around in a wheelbarrow. So yeah, letting the players have their choice can be a blessing or a curse. I think.
Yeah, and it's kind of silly in its own way, right? Because uh, you either have a group that's going to say, "Oh, I'm rolling 20s on all the size charts," or you have a group that's thinking to themselves, "Well, I'll keep things mostly realistic."
Yeah, yeah,
And you probably know as soon as you're setting out with the game which type your players are.
yeah. It's probably
Uh,
best
well,
suited to NPCs.
yeah, so let's
That
make a
brings me
note
on
of that.
to a slightly touchier subject.
Mhm.
And I want to be clear that I'm not against the inclusion of any of these things. I like inclusive games. I just don't like forced anything in any games. But your chart for sexual preference and gender expression seems to be wildly at odds with reality. So even as an NPC chart, it doesn't really seem to work for me. So I was kind of wondering what your intent was there, because I've done charts for NPC creation or optional character creation in other books where I've tried to be more simulationist. So I've tried to represent the true ethnic mix of a particular country if it's a modern game. I've tried to represent the authentic as we can figure out from the statistics, sort of how many people are straight, how many people are gay, how many people are bisexual, how many people are trans. And I've tried to represent that in reality. So taking it as a D20, for example, from the American census, it's about 5% of people are LGBT. That's all included, which would be a roll of 1 on a D20. And the number of people who are trans is something like half of 1%. I think it's slightly under that. Whereas your chart makes all of these things wildly more common. Is there a particular reason that you decided to go that way rather than a more simulationist route?
Certainly. So, uh, it's on its own. I just looked at the chart, and you're right. The numbers are they don't closely match reality. Uh, oh no, I had a thread of thought and then I lost it. Let's get it back. So this is another aspect that's like, or another part of the book that maybe is a relic of the beginning of the way I was doing it, because what I say that's contradictory to this in some places is that really when the GM's playing, there's not a whole lot of sense in making hard and fast sexuality NPCs. Because if I think about a situation where we have this terrible Wizard of Skald, and the players are running up the tower, and one of them thinks to themselves, well, we could fight him hand to hand to the death, or I could see if he's susceptible to my wiles. And if the player is met with, yeah, sorry, I don't swing that way, that's kind of disappointing and against the theme of exploration.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, I don't think there's a whole lot besides to show character, to have really hard and fast sexual identities as you make NPCs. I think it's absolutely an important part of a PC's identity, and a player's, how they choose to play their character. But I think if I did the table over again, and I have intention to, I plan on this document being a living document, and people being able to see the most recent version. I think I would reduce the incidence of LGBTQ so that it was closer in line with statistics, but I don't think I'm that concerned about being hyper realistic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that D&D being a game where people can play whatever they want to play, I think that I don't think there's much harm in widening the incidence.
Mm. Of course, it would depend what style you're playing. If you're playing something that's more medieval realistic, then the society is likely to be quite repressive,
certainly,
and unaccepting. Whereas if you're playing something like Forgotten Realms, it's everything's sort of hanging out there.
Right.
So,
and history is interesting in its own right, because you end up with these odd distances from our current reality, where sex, or in the medieval ages in medieval Europe, you have all these ideas about, well, sex is okay, but procreation should be done under very very serious and specific circumstances, and different, but not exactly what we would think of ideas of homosexuality or different gender expression. But I don't know. I don't think I'm too concerned about being hyper realistic, because I think that in the games that at least I run, I'm willing to make some major concessions the uh, so that the world is something that the players would like to play in.
Hmm.
You can imagine if you had uh, the state of women certainly over the course of history has not been a uh, a good one. And if you insisted upon, here we are, we're in ancient Sumeria, and we're playing with the era appropriate rule set, and people roll up female characters, and you say, well, wait a second, your roles are going to be very distinct,
Hmm.
except for the few in heroic mythology.
Of course,
And
player characters tend to be exceptions
they do.
anyway. Um, I personally don't tend to like to ride roughshod over history if I'm setting something historically, because I feel that that's disrespectful to the people who had to struggle and cope with that society back then. But players are always exceptions. I mean, it's always been the case that if you're rich or powerful in some way, you had a lot more latitude than anyone else did. There are many famous Victorian adventuresses who usually came from wealthy backgrounds and so on, who were able to do anything that a man could due to their position, but they were the exception rather than the
Mhm.
rule. They are so interesting because they contrast with the world that was around them at the time. So
Yes, there's absolutely something to be said for the uniqueness and the excitement of being someone who does buck that trend, or playing someone who does.
I found the backgrounds and class options were quite well done, but they didn't all seem to be particularly thematic. I'm thinking of the Wretch and the Barbarian in particular. The Wretch feels more like a fury, blood drinking, not particularly erotic. Got to be said, having your heart torn out and eaten, and the Wretch just felt like a gutter snipe rather than a bawd or a pimp or that sort of vice like criminal. Um, was that a conscious thing? Did you want to bring in ideas that you had from elsewhere into the book, or
Um, I think the classes have been some of the most difficult for me to write. I think in terms of backgrounds, I I wanted to express, or no, not express. I wanted to offer to people a pretty wide range uh, of backgrounds, of
mm,
opportunities for where their character had come from and what that sort of would provide them with. Um, it is very much down the ladder. So you start with the courtesan, who is certainly a high-minded society folk, and then all the way down to the wretch or to the slave. And these are, oh no, I think the wretch is at the bottom. And it could be that that's too far. Like it could easily be that is a point that no one would really want to play.
mm,
No one would want to enter into this sort of uh, wish fulfillment uh, place, sexual wish fulfillment, and be coming from such a disadvantaged position. And I'll have to look back at that, and I value your opinion on whether it's extra, could be snipped off.
well,
But
for
uh
me, it's just that they didn't seem to fit the overall theme of the book. I mean, I thought they were well done. It's just they didn't seem to slot into the erotic idea of the book.
Gotcha. Okay, so I'll have to revisit them.
Mm,
As for the classes, I actually uh, the and maybe this is just from my perspective having written it, but I actually struggled the most with not the barbarian but the ranger.
mm,
And some of these classes exist in a very clear thematic space. For the barbarian, I felt like it was a clear thematic space of this sort of like strength by blood right,
mm,
and by sort of uh, consensual conquest.
mm.
Like, here you're my enemy. I have thrown you down with the strength of my arms. Now the next step is to bring some sexual motive into it. Uh, but not all the classes, not all the subclasses, I should say, have that kind of strong thematic bone, and that's something I intend to improve over time, and would very much like to spend more time on.
Do
Uh,
rogues get a bonus for doing it from behind?
oh, they just might. I'll have to, but they certainly get all those shadowy bonuses, and of course, I couldn't go this book without putting in the paladin being the aspect of virginity.
One other thing you added that I didn't think was necessarily necessary were new skills. Skills are very much at a premium in 5th edition, unlike, say 3rd edition, we had plenty of skill points to splash around. Why did you feel that new skills were needed? Couldn't you just substitute intimidation for domination, performance for sensuality, and persuasion for submission, for example?
Absolutely, yeah. I think I make a note about that in the book, of that these could certainly map onto existing skills, but uh, I didn't feel like they were quite adequate, the ones that we had already. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons is I think the idea of a sexual skill being inherently based is is a trap in and of itself.
Mm.
Because if we say, like, for one thing, intimidate. Well, no, I think intimidate is fine. But in any case, if you enter into a game with the thought, we're all going to be paramours, Lotharios, uh, we're going to be seducing wenches and wizards left and right, and then you enter into a situation where you have your barbarian and you have your sorcerer, and your sorcerer walks up and sweet talks the wench, and your barbarian tries to walk up to the wizard and finds that his social skills, unsurprisingly, not so great. And so, do you have certain classes that are naturally disadvantaged at sex? Do you have classes which are, you either have to hobble your main skills in order to make sure you're able to live uh, this exciting game? And what I ended up deciding was that the skills involved should be conditional.
Mm.
And I make a note about that at the end of the section, saying, if you're the GM here, really what you should be doing is you should be allowing your players to pick a pick the skill that they're using, pick the
Mm.
ability to, I should say. So
Yeah.
if the bard walks up and plays this sweet little ditty to capture someone's heart, then it makes sense for that to be a performance check.
Mm.
Whereas if you're pounding down drinks to impress someone with the might of your stomach and your liver, respectively, then maybe you go for some sort of constitution check. Uh, and so I kept these individual skills because I wanted them to be distinct enough and different enough from the existing skills, so that it leapt more easily to mind that you could use any ability for these depending on how the situation demanded. And maybe they should be skill proficiencies or tool proficiencies, so that they more easily map onto that idea.
Mm.
Uh, but that was the thought process behind it.
Mm. Never heard of trying to impress someone with your internal organs before, but
Oh, you should give
ladies,
it a try.
ladies, I have a rakishly fetching spleen. I
You'd
guess you
love
could.
my liver if you ever met it.
I guess you could, to compensate for the skill scarcity in 5th edition, just allow everyone to choose one of those that they're proficient in, and then if they want to take extra ones with more skill slots, they can. That would be one way around it.
That's a
I
good
think
idea.
I think that's all my questions and topics. Really, we're just a bit over an hour. What are your plans for the future? More related products?
Yeah, so I'd like to form some sort of bestiary, however, and I'd like to, of course, that runs into problems with licensed creatures and so on.
Hmm.
Uh, but I would like to work on that book or booklets that I was talking about that explore the more individual interests, allow for more experienced GMs and more experienced players to have more nuanced takes on things. I think spells, items, I had great fun designing all sorts of spells and items and could certainly go on for ages more, I'm sure. But
Yeah, it can feel a bit silly doing that.
it can.
But then if you look at, so my guideline when I was writing Blue Magic and Temptress was I looked at the way technology was used in sexuality and thought, okay, how will magic be used in similar
Uh,
ways? And if you look at it that way, and you look at the huge variety of toys and sex dolls and different kinds of lubricant and everything else, then sexual magic items seem a lot less silly.
right. Well, you've heard the saying, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right?
Yeah.
Think along those lines a lot. Like a lot of the things that the items or the spells that I've created
Mm.
are technologies that exist today and wouldn't have existed back then, but we think of as relatively normal.
Yeah.
So, you crank up some automaton whirligig sexual toy, and it functions like a vibrator from today's age,
Yeah. Yeah.
so on and so forth.
It's got to beat Cleopatra's bees anyway. And this is a living document, so you're going to update it as you go along.
Yeah.
Okay, so where can people find you and find your games and stuff?
Certainly. So I have a Gumroad link. Currently, I'm selling the book itself on Gumroad, and the idea is for that to always be the most recent edition of the book, but anticipating uh, small edits and errata to be published thereafter. I also have a Patreon page, and on that Patreon page, by subscribing, you get uh, you get the book as it evolves, all new editions, and so on. And depending on the tier, also access to uh, upcoming supplements or your place in the credits or things that you've created under some circumstances being added and so on.
Cool. You'll give me those links, and I'll drop them in at the end.
Absolutely.
We did have a question in the chat.
Hmm.
I think we really covered it. Quoth says, wouldn't that kind of seduction be better handled with a persuasion check to represent social skills, with the option of another skill or attribute check giving advantage? That would be another way to handle it.
That's a good idea. I have these three basic skills that I'm mapping from persuasion, no, uh, sensuality, domination, and submission, and for these to be uh, those flexible skills that can map, like you said, onto the existing ones. Intimidation. The best I could figure out for submission would be deception, but that was one of the things that stuck in my craw a little bit. Is I don't think those two are necessarily related at all.
Yeah. I go Kobe said I much preferred third ed's skill system to fifth edition. But
Yes,
yeah,
there are a lot
what
of
can you
things
do?
I missed about 3.5. That's what I grew up with.
Yeah. Oh, I'm older than that, but let's not go into that. Right, I think that's about it. Unless there's anything else you wanted to bring up, or
Yeah. What would be the number one thing you think new GMs trying out this kind of sexual aspect to their D&D game playing? What do you think the number one thing they should know is?
to make sure everyone knows what they're in for ahead of time. Now, like I said, I'm not really into these consent forms and things for normal play, particularly around horror and so on. But I think sexuality is so deeply personal that people at least need to be forewarned to the extent that you say, look, this is going to be a relatively explicit 18 plus game, and then maybe give them a good way to do this is to give them a point of cultural reference. So like this is going to be like Game of Thrones, or
Ah,
or oh, was that Gladiator series on HBO, wasn't there?
Oh yes,
Spartacus, was it Spartacus? I
I
don't know.
think it was.
Yeah, Spartacus, Blood and Sand. There was a lot of sex in that, so you can use those as points of reference. Yeah, and that gives everyone a touchstone to go kind of, aha, okay, I know what I'm in for. So that would be my advice.
Good. I think that's very good.
Cool. Right. Well, we'll draw a line under it there. We'll drop links in the description later. Thanks for watching and listening. I'll throw a link onto my main channel to bring people across to watch. Thanks for being with us, Jasper. Good luck with the product.
Absolutely.
And
It's been wonderful. Thank you for having me on.
hey, anytime. Right. Bye, everyone.
Good night.